The partial government shutdown that has paralyzed federal operations for weeks may be approaching resolution, but confusion reigns in Washington as President Trump sends contradictory signals about what conditions he would accept to reopen shuttered agencies and restore paychecks to hundreds of thousands of furloughed workers. Congressional leaders from both parties describe negotiations as chaotic and unpredictable, with White House positions shifting between meetings, and Trump himself publicly undermining his own negotiators by announcing different demands through social media posts that catch even his senior staff by surprise and leave lawmakers uncertain about whether proposed compromises will receive presidential support or rejection. The fundamental dispute centers on federal spending priorities and policy riders attached to appropriations bills, but the specifics of what Trump actually wants remain frustratingly opaque to negotiators attempting to craft legislative language that could command bipartisan support while satisfying presidential demands. Initial White House statements emphasized certain policy objectives and spending levels, but subsequent comments from Trump have introduced new requirements, walked back previous positions, and created ambiguity about whether earlier stated priorities remain operative or have been superseded by evolving presidential thinking that may reflect internal White House debates or simply impulsive reactions to media coverage and political pressures. Republican congressional leaders find themselves in the uncomfortable position of negotiating without clear authority or confidence that agreements they reach will receive presidential endorsement, creating reluctance to make concessions to Democrats or expend political capital on compromise proposals that Trump might disavow at any moment. Several senior Republicans have privately expressed frustration that the White House seems more interested in political theater and blame assignment than actually resolving the impasse, with some suggesting that Trump views the shutdown primarily as leverage for broader political objectives, unrelated to the specific appropriations disputes that triggered the funding lapse. Democrats face their own strategic dilemmas as they attempt to balance several competing imperatives, including protecting federal workers facing financial hardship, avoiding blame for extended dysfunction, maintaining party unity around core principles, and extracting maximum policy concessions in exchange for votes to reopen government. The party's calculus involves assessing how long public opinion will support their resistance to Trump's demands, versus when blame for continued shutdown will shift from the president to congressional Democrats, a judgment complicated by mixed polling data and the reality that different constituencies within the Democratic coalition have varying tolerance for extended confrontation versus pressure to compromise and restore government services. The human impact of the shutdown grows more severe with each passing day, as federal employees miss additional paychecks, contractors lose income with no guarantee of back pay, and government services ranging from food safety inspections to national park maintenance to scientific research suffer disruption that in some cases may cause permanent damage to programs and personnel. Stories of federal workers visiting food banks, taking second jobs, and facing eviction generate sympathetic media coverage that creates political pressure on both parties to resolve the impasse. But so far, neither side has demonstrated willingness to make the concessions necessary for breakthrough. Despite growing evidence that prolonged shutdown inflicts real harm on Americans dependent on government services and the hundreds of thousands of families living paycheck to paycheck without savings, to weather extended income loss. Behind closed doors, discussions involve not just the immediate appropriations questions but broader concerns about budget process, presidential authority, congressional prerogatives, and the precedents being established for future confrontations between the executive and legislative branches. Some lawmakers worry that resolving this particular shutdown through capitulation to presidential demands regardless of merit would encourage future chief executives to weaponize government funding as routine leverage for unrelated policy objectives, fundamentally altering the balance of power between branches in ways that undermine constitutional checks and balances. Others argue that the current situation already represents such severe institutional dysfunction that preventing immediate humanitarian harm must take priority over abstract concerns about precedent and constitutional norms. Economic analysts warn that extended government shutdown threatens to trigger broader slowdown in the national economy, beyond the direct impact of suspended federal operations and lost wages for government employees, as uncertainty about when services will resume affects business planning, consumer confidence, and financial markets increasingly concerned that political dysfunction signals deeper governance problems. Initial economic projections assumed brief shutdown with minimal macroeconomic consequences, But as the impasse extends beyond initial expectations, forecasters are revising growth estimates downward and warning that prolonged funding lapse could subtract measurable percentage points from quarterly GDP growth, while increasing unemployment and undermining the economic expansion that has been among Trump's most important political assets. The Federal Reserve faces difficult decisions about how to incorporate shutdown impact into monetary policy deliberations, with some officials arguing that temporary fiscal disruption should not influence interest rate decisions, while others contend that political dysfunction creating economic drag warrants more accommodative monetary stance to offset contractionary effects of shutdown. The central bank's communications carefully avoid appearing to take sides in political dispute, but the economic reality that extended shutdown weakens growth creates implicit pressure on the administration to resolve the impasse before damage becomes severe enough to force Fed intervention that Trump would likely criticize despite his own role in creating the conditions necessitating such response. State and local governments experience cascading effects as federal funding streams dry up and federal workers reduce spending in their communities, creating ripple effects through regional economies, particularly in areas with heavy concentration of federal employment or dependence on federal contracts and grants. Governors and mayors from both parties are pressuring their congressional delegations to resolve the shutdown regardless of partisan considerations, as the practical consequences of suspended federal operations increasingly override ideological positions about spending priorities and policy disputes. This pressure from state and local officials creates political incentives for members of Congress to demonstrate responsiveness to constituent concerns, even if it requires breaking with party leadership or accepting compromises that purists in both parties would prefer to reject. Trump's own political calculations appear to involve assessment of whether blame for shutdown will ultimately accrue primarily to him or to congressional Democrats, with the president's social media commentary suggesting confidence that he can maintain public perception that Democrats are responsible for the impasse, despite considerable evidence that voters hold the president accountable for government dysfunction during his administration. Internal White House polling reportedly shows more complicated picture, with significant segments of Trump's own coalition expressing concern about shutdown impact and preferring resolution, even if it requires presidential compromise. But whether these private assessments influence Trump's public positioning remains unclear, as he continues projecting absolute confidence in his negotiating leverage and political position. The shutdown's impact on Trump's broader political agenda compounds the immediate crisis, as legislative initiatives unrelated to appropriations stall, while congressional attention remains consumed by funding dispute and cooperation between branches necessary for any significant policy achievement becomes impossible during active confrontation over basic government operations. Republican policy priorities, including various regulatory reforms, judicial confirmations, and legislative proposals, languish without floor time or executive attention, creating opportunity costs that some administration officials privately acknowledge may exceed any benefits gained from shutdown leverage, even if Trump ultimately extracts some concessions from Democrats on the spending dispute. International implications receive inadequate attention in domestic political coverage, but foreign governments and financial markets watch American shutdown drama as indicator of governance capacity and political stability, with meaningful consequences for diplomatic relationships and economic confidence. Allied governments express private concern that American political dysfunction undermines reliability and credibility at a moment when global challenges require steady American leadership and engagement, while adversaries exploit the spectacle of Washington paralysis to argue that democratic systems produce inherent instability and weakness compared to authoritarian alternatives. The damage to American soft power and international standing may persist long after the immediate shutdown ends, particularly if extended funding lapse confirms international perceptions that American political system has become too dysfunctional to address even basic governance responsibilities requiring routine cooperation between branches and parties.